Welcome one and all. I'd like to just commence, as is customary at events like this, in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders past and present. It's my delight to introduce Miss Maureen Frank this afternoon. I think it's just turned this afternoon. The title of the conversation is Gender Diversity and Challenging Unconscious Bias, How Can Organizations Start Getting Results? I would like to just tell you a little bit about Maureen, and I'm sure once she comes on stage you'll find that she's an extremely vibrant person and very engaging, and happy to take questions as well, of course. Maureen Frank is the founder of Embrun, an innovative Australian company specialising in creating sustainable, positive change in women. She is also the creator of My Mentor, a suite of women's advancement programs, and the men's gender leadership programs undertaken by thousands across Australia and India. Maureen is Australia's preeminent expert on gender diversity and women's advancement and has been recognised globally for her acumen and initiatives. She works with international clients, the ASX 100 corporations, and Australian government agencies. Maureen is an entrepreneur, a best-selling author, business strategist, facilitator, and professional speaker on the global stage. And at an individual level, she helps people transform their lives through practical guidance, skill development, and motivation. A former lawyer, Maureen moved to the UK in the mid-1990s, where she was a major player in the then fledgling mergers and acquisitions insurance industry. In 2001, she returned to Australia to create and head up Aon's local mergers and acquisitions team. Within 3 years, her department was the largest producer of new revenue for Aon, having cracked the hard-nosed investment banking and private equity worlds in Australia. With Aon internationally, Maureen was recognised as a standout performer. Within Australia, she won a Telstra Businesswoman of the Year award in 2004. In 2005, she established Embrun to provide diversity, strategy and communication consultancy services, gender inclusion, programs for organisations, mentoring, development and retention solutions for women, and gender leadership and development tools for men. In that same year, Maureen was named a BRW Rising Star. Another major coup for Maureen was serving as a key advisor in Telstra's 2010 Global Catalyst Award. Finally, she sits on Amcor's and Coca-Cola Amatil's Diversity Councils. We're delighted that Maureen attained a Bachelor of Commerce and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Queensland, and we're very proud of her as alumni and her achievements. Before inviting her to the stage, I'd just like to remind you that the event is being recorded, and there will be an opportunity for questions. If you can wait until the mic comes across to you, that will certainly enhance the clarity in which we can hear the question and also on the recording. Please join me in welcoming Maureen to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello everyone, it's a great honour to be here certainly it was a great honour to be asked to come here because I certainly thoroughly enjoyed my days at the University of Queensland, and I think it's fantastic for people who went to that university to be able to connect in a further way, because I know that connecting with people from the past, it's an amazing network. You know, I think the people who have been to the University of Queensland are quite phenomenal, and I think staying in touch is absolutely important. Look, I wanted to start today, so Ian's told you a lofty story which sounds, you know, quite like I've had a very easy ride, but I thought I'd go back before to explain why diversity is actually has become very important in my life, but has always been very important in my life. And then talk about some practical skills and some things that I have been doing in organisations which actually start to make a difference. Is my sound okay? Yeah, okay. I think, you know, because it will give you context. You know, to me, I actually started life in Toowoomba. So, Toowoomba girl, I was, and interestingly, diversity was a big part of my world from when I was very young. So my father was born in India, my mother was born in Ireland, they met in Nairobi in Africa, and somehow my sister and I were born in Toowoomba. You know, to me, what happened was my father was a doctor. He was sponsored into Australia by an uncle on the basis that he had to change his name. So you must change your name because otherwise you might be treated differently in Australia. So I grew up in an environment where we were told, my sister and I, don't tell anyone where you really come from. And it was, so it was that notion of, you in order to fit in. So we grew up differently, because the other, I think, difference, particularly in that era, was that the biggest feminist in our household was my dad. So my dad had grown up in India, where his mother had been widowed at quite a young age, but she'd worked 3 jobs and she had put 3 kids through university and done the best for her kids. So economic security for women was really important to my dad, and he kept thumping those messages in to my sister and I. My sister, UQ graduate as well, but from the School of Medicine. So I think, but I remember thinking, what is he on about? But those messages came home loud and clear later in my life. What happened then is my sister very dutifully went off to the University of Queensland, moved on to one of the residential campuses, and I was a bit of a rebel. So at the age of 16, I actually approached my mother and father and said, well, you know what? I think I want to be an actress. And very cleverly, they said to me, well, if you want to be an actress, you can go out to the local institute, which is, of course, now the University of South East Queensland, or we'll pay for you to go and live on campus in Brisbane. And I think your sister goes to toga parties and rugby clubs and those sorts of things. Did anyone frequent those places? So off I went, and I decided that the qualification most like acting was law. I was very, very partial to LA law in those days. Who remembers LA law? Ladies, who remembers Harry Hamlin? I was in like Flynn. And it was, in I went, and my careers advisor told me that you should also do commerce with it, because that can lead you in a couple of other directions. But, because I had no business people in my family, I really didn't know what that meant. I really didn't know what that world was all about. And, thank goodness I made that decision. I managed to actually get through, despite toga parties and rugby clubs, I managed to actually get through and do reasonably well with my degrees, and found that I loved law and I loved my business studies. I then went and started working with a national law firm, I learnt within quick time frame 2 things. Number one, I wasn't really a particularly good lawyer. And one of my colleagues from that firm is here, so she might smile at that. But also that I didn't particularly like it. And I think in those days there's quite a notion that if you've done law, this is your box and this is where you have to go. And certainly from my perspective, I didn't really have a lot of people to go and speak to. But in the context of working in that organisation, and it was an excellent grounding in a whole lot of different things, but I met a lot of business people, clients, and I thought, you know what, I want to be one of them. I want to be a business person. How do I become that? And fortunately, I had that understanding of economics and finances as a background. So I decided to do that in my way, which was all about building a network in Brisbane. So I joined all kinds of non-legal business networks, and finally I actually found an entrepreneur that was setting up a business in the legal insurance area. And I thought, I think I could do that. But I remember it had a very high profile board, so in terms of selection, I was very nervous about the notion of switching into a different career. I had a high profile board, jumped in and found that I could really love my job. So it was completely non-legal. It was all about building relationships. It was all about building a business. I then went with that organisation to London, set up their operations in London. But then in the year 2000, and I'm going to mention this because it's very, very pertinent to diversity and was probably my biggest lesson in diversity, was that I gave birth to my twin daughters. So Celine and Georgia, and I think I've got a few pictures here. Yes, I have changed hair colour, for anyone. my girls. And it was an interesting time because in London, what became very apparent was that I was very likely to become a single mother. So I remember I'd resigned my job in London, and I was absolutely terrified. Those messages from my father came crashing home to me around economic security. How was I going to financially support 2 kids on my own? How do single parents do this? I really couldn't get my head around it. Anyway, I went back into my boss in London, global company, and said, you need to get me a job in Australia. So started negotiations. So I was in the area of mergers and acquisitions. I'd had a very busy time in London. Private equity, big deals, got to ride a Piaggio motor scooter when my client bought Piaggio. They wouldn't let me ride in the Ferrari when we bought Ferrari. But it was you know, so it was a really interesting time, and I thought, well, I love that work. They didn't have that business in Australia, so the private equity market was in fledgling stage in Australia at that stage. Came back, was in negotiations with the Australian CEO. Came back to Brisbane and was, you know, a lot of things then happened at once. So within a really quick time frame, a couple of things happened. Number one, I came back from one of those trips. My parents had been looking after my girls, and I discovered that my daughter Celine had cerebral palsy. Then within the same period, my ex decided that he was going. And the third thing that happened was I got a phone call from that CEO to say, yep, you've got the job, we're going to set up an M&A department, but you have to move to Sydney. So I had to make a really big decision. And, you know, like all girls, when making a hard decision, I did a spreadsheet. Luckily, I'd been taught that. Might have had a bit of help. And it was all around, you know, how can I afford to be in Sydney and hire a nanny, and how can I, and I think, you know, there's a lot of emotion in that, but there's a, you know, I think to me it was all about getting practical, and, or if I stay in Brisbane, what's that going to look like? And Sydney won. I hired a nanny, and went back to work full time when the girls were 9 months old. Love my work. You know, it's one of those things where it was a fabulous time building a business, and I think I really did it differently. It was all about spending and creating real relationships with those private equity guys. You know, within a 3-year period, we had every single private equity firm in Australia as our clients. We worked on every single major M&A transaction that had happened in Australia, and but I'd never really sat back to reflect on the fact that the business had been successful. And in the midst of that, and this is always my advice, is, you know, I always think you should ask for what you want after you've had a big success. So I had a particularly large M&A deal, made a huge amount of money for my organisation, and I went to the CEO with a 20-page business plan and said, I think I could do this role from Brisbane, because I had a large office here in Brisbane. And, you know, the surprising response was, I'm surprised it's taken you so long to ask. So I moved back to Brisbane, I commuted to Sydney, but I had a bit more headspace, my kids had more support, and getting that bit of balance meant my business doubled in size in the year that I moved back to Brisbane. So anyone who ever says you can't run a business from Brisbane that has got, you know, an interstate connectivity is absolutely wrong. It gave me, the plane time gave me headspace, and it actually was a time when you didn't have emails and phone calls and all of those sorts of things. Anyway, and then, as Ian said, my world changed again, because you know, a friend of mine nominated me for the Telstra Businesswoman of the Year Awards, and which I laughed at. And in that process, we had the company that I worked for had a strategic alliance with a big law firm, and there was a woman in that law firm by the name of Elizabeth Broderick, who had been a Telstra Businesswoman of the Year as well. And I don't know if anyone know her, but she's now the Federal Sex Discrimination Commissioner. And she took me under her wing. She made me go into those awards. She practically wrote the application, and she's been my mentor and big supporter ever since. Anyway, I was fortunate enough to win, and I think that then what happened as a consequence of that within my own organisation was I got emails from women from all over the world saying, can you help me? Can you help me do what you've done? And I was really baffled that women sometimes felt that they didn't have the confidence to go for it, because I thought, nothing particularly special about me. I'll work hard, but I'm not that smart. You know, and it was, but also I was questioning whether they were actually being given the opportunities, because I absolutely recognised that I had been able to grow in this role because I had a unique specialisation. So no one really understood what I did. They just knew it made money, right? And that put me in a unique position. So I knew not everyone had that capacity. So I decided it was time to start to do something about it. So hence I launched off into my own business and have been working, as Ian said, with lots and lots of companies in this space since then. I think the importance of mentioning my daughter Celine is this, is that, you know, it's interesting, and I think that she is the epitome of diversity. She thinks completely differently. She is you know, a little kid who was diagnosed as not being able to walk or talk when she was 5 months old, but, you know, got her Irish grandmother's genes, and she walked at 2 and she talked at 3. So she has phenomenal belief in herself. But her biggest advantage has been her sister. So her sister has pushed her the whole time. And her sister fundamentally does not believe that her sister has a disability. So treats her with the same challenge and without difference. She challenges us every day. She thinks differently. She's got right hemiparesis cerebral palsy, which means that one lobe of her brain is much larger than the other. So it's difficult sometimes working with people who are different to you. Our natural tendency is to hire people who are like us, isn't it? Because people who are different are challenging. But you know what? In order to create great organisations, we need that challenge and we need that difference. And that's what I'm a big proponent of. Yes, I'm a big proponent of gender diversity, but to me, difference more broadly is also just as important. And certainly that's been my quest in terms of the work that we do and have managed to do so reasonably successfully. I want to share with you some strategies. So some of the things that we do, and why has this worked for some organisations and why hasn't it? So, you know, in terms of the current environment in Australia, are all of you familiar with what has happened in the gender diversity space at the moment? Is it people familiar with what's going on? Okay, so I'm telling you something new for some of you. What happened a couple of years ago? So in terms of women in leadership in Australia, Australia has the worst statistics in the Western world. So 10% of people in management in Australia are women, 90% men. And I want to just say at the start of this, please don't think that I'm an anti-male person, because I'm really not. I always say I'm a new age feminist, and the new age feminist also really loves men. Because I actually think that the secret to success with this is men. Because to me, if 10% of the people in management are women, the people who have real influence, the 90%, are male. So they need to come on board with this. And that's a lot of the work that I've been doing with organisations. Yes, I've been doing work with women because I want them to be pushing and putting their hand up and saying, yes, I want that job. But you need people there who are going to pull them through and sponsor them and understand that there are differences between genders. So, but this is a significant economic issue. So to me, I realised when even though I had a personal passion about diversity and difference, it's not enough. It had to be based on economic value. So, and I knew that if I was going to talk to the CEOs I was used to talking to in my M&A days, they were only going to be interested in money at the end of the day. So what was the business case associated with this? And what we found was that, not only did Australia have these terrible statistics, but the statistic didn't make sense. Because the other factor that we learned is that, Australia is #1 in the world in educating women, Global Economic Forum figures. #1. That's like the Olympics, right? That's pretty phenomenal. We have the most educated women in the world. And as you probably know, 55%, excuse me, 55% of graduates, sorry, 55% of graduates are also female. There is a significant gender gap in Australia, and there was a report done by Goldman Sachs a couple of years ago. And basically what that report said was that if you could close the gap between men and women in Australia, it would impact GDP by 11%, which is bigger than the mining industry, just to give you some perception. So what's the gap? When I first read that report, I kind of ruffled on the feathers a little bit. One of the things that they said was that women in Australia were underproductive. Didn't like that statement at all. But when I read between the lines, what it meant was that women tended to be in lesser roles than what they were capable of. They also tended to be in the less productive areas of the economy. So there was a high incidence of women, being in hospitality and retail and those sorts of things, not mining and transport and some of the growing areas of the economy. So it's a significant amount of money, which I think is oh, excuse me, I'm getting there. So there's a significant business case. But what I want to show you is that what I have found is that if you break diversity down into a couple of key impact areas, and this is what I share with my clients. So firstly, getting people to recognise that there is an underutilisation of the entire talent pool. So this notion that if 55% of graduates are women and they're highly educated, why aren't we using them? It doesn't make sense. In an environment where we've had skill shortage and those sorts of things, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense. The other thing that people commonly say to me is, well, Maureen, it'll all come out in the wash. We've got these Gen Ys, they're really keen, and it'll all just kind of happen eventually. It's not the case. There's an average pay gap between men and women in Australia of 17%. In some industries, it's as large as 29%. So financial services is 29%. What they find is that gap exists within 2 years of graduation. So it is still absolutely there. The other important thing to note is that we've always had a good talent pool of educated women. So in 1975, 44% of graduates were women. So it has not translated, and that's hence why there has been some intervention. So what the Stock Exchange have done in reading these reports and seeing the economic impact, sorry, I've got a cough lolly in my bag. Can you sorry. I've got a bit of a tickle, I'm really sorry. Thank you very much. What the ASX have done is they've now required listed companies to report on what they're doing with respect to gender, which seems like a very radical move. But if you look at the economics and you look at the fact that we have actually known about the economics for quite some time, but companies have not done anything about it. So now what we found is there's some companies who were doing things anyway, but now all listed companies are required to do it. So you're seeing a kind of mad rush in terms of what, and what does that mean? They're expecting companies to set targets. So no, there's a huge debate around targets versus quotas and those sorts of things, but it's about actually having some goals around doing this. So this issue has been elevated to executive team level, CEO level, and there's a lot of work being done in this space in Australia. So when people say to me, but there just aren't any female applicants, that's where you've got to challenge and say, well, yes, there are. There's a whole lot of us. So underutilisation of the entire talent pool, it doesn't make sense. Second one is accountability and where it sits. I'll go through all of these in more detail. Leveraging stakeholder groups. Skill shortage. Understanding that engagement equals profit. Retention, understanding that people leave for different reasons. Attraction, becoming a magnet. Getting men engaged. I'm going to have to take a minute. Sorry. Sorry about that. Getting men engaged, which was absolutely critical. So historically, with affirmative action measures, they've been all very female-centric. They've all been about creating women's networks and those sorts of things. I do believe that women's networks can be very valuable, but you also need to engage men in that process. So men need to feel part of the equation. Keeping score, so actually measuring what's happening and understanding your story. Why is this important for your organisation? So just to go through some of those, As I mentioned, Goldman Sachs report, you know, I think that that was something that kind of shook the powers that be in the corporate world in Australia to see an impact like that to that degree. The other thing that has happened is not only the ASX requirements, but EOA, which is the Equal Opportunity for Women in the Workplace agency. So if you are a company that has 100 or more employees, you're required to report to EOA, regardless of whether you're listed or not, around what's happening in the gender space. Now, EOA for many years was a bit of a toothless tiger. It really didn't have the capacity to do anything if someone was non-compliant, but that's all changing. So EOA has been properly funded. It's becoming a tiger with some teeth, and over the next couple of years, that's what we're going to see. So what will happen is organisations that are not doing things in this space and not getting results, so more results orientation, will be named and shamed, and questions will start to be asked. So I think that there will come a time where women will be able to actually have a lot of public information around what are the best places for women to work in Australia. So in terms of the overall gender gap index, Australia's number 23, which doesn't make a lot of sense. God, I'm choking here. Doesn't make a huge amount of sense when we've also got the most educated women in the world. So just so you know, in terms of that ranking, there are a number of third world countries that do better than us. In terms of accountability, I think that many organisations now, but I think less so, have really made the decision that this is a HR issue. We'll get HR to fix it. But accountability, it needs to be treated as a business issue. And accountability needs to sit with the CEO and the executive team. How do you convince the CEO and executive team that that is the case? Numbers, not emotion. So this is an example. There is a huge supply of data which shows you that organisations that have a higher proportion of women in senior roles are more profitable, hands down. Remember, I had and this one is an example. So Catalyst survey found that companies that met that criteria had a higher return on investment and a higher return to shareholders. You know, there's a McKinsey report that basically found that organisations that had that statistic outperformed on all organisational criteria. So there was some method to it. So what is it? You know, I remember I had a cheeky journalist, and I used to say, when I say higher proportion of women, I don't mean 50-50. This is actually based on about 30% in senior roles. I had a cheeky journalist kind of say to me once, you know, is it about those 3 women who are just so exceptional on the executive team and they're bringing in all this money? I said, it's not about that. The thing is that when you see a mixed or diverse executive team, you're actually much more likely to see that as part of the culture of the whole business. So if you drill down, you'll see it throughout the business. And what does it bring? It brings different thought to the equation. So, you know, coming from Toowoomba, I'll give you a rugby analogy because I went to a rugby school where, you know, you wouldn't run onto the rugby field with a team full of props. You need your 5'8", you need your hooker, you need your centre, and that's what diversity is. You need people in your team who are not like you. You need people in your team that are going to give a different perspective. And if we take gender as an example, just one example of diversity, women and men do think differently. And I know that's a generalisation because you'll always get exceptions to that. But generally speaking, there's a whole lot of scientific data which proves that. So I get very upset in organisations where senior women have felt that they've had to behave in a masculine way in order to be successful. Because actually what they're not bringing to the equation is the skills of being a woman and feminine leadership, which are actually incredibly valuable. It's not saying that one is better than the other, but the combination of both leads to profit. So in Goldman Sachs report, I've already mentioned that, but that's the basis of which they've driven it. Look, I think the most important thing is to be leadership driven. Like, I deal with a lot of companies. I mean, we're at the stage in our business, we just have to turn companies away because there is such a demand for this right now. And the most critical thing is the CEO's engagement. So for me, right now, if the CEO is not engaged and involved in the process, I won't work with them because it's not going to work. And I actually say to those organisations, go back and sort this out because you're wasting your money with me or anybody else. And anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong. Because if the message doesn't come from the top, it's not going to work. And I think in experience with companies who've been successful with this, that has been the key to success. Now, don't expect your CEOs all to get this immediately, but you need to take them on a journey. You know, I've spent a lot of time personally coaching a number of CEOs on understanding this more and then getting practical about it. What do I actually have to do is what I start to hear. And that's not a criticism of those CEOs. They just have, this is a new concept to some of them. And in some industries, like I work quite substantially in what I would describe as hard hat industries. There's a lot of work in the mining industry, rail, transport. That, you know, that a lot of those senior people have never really worked with women before. It's not their fault, it's just the industry. So there's an education process and there's some genuine fear. But we need to confront that fear and have a conversation and help people understand, because understanding reduces fear quite significantly. So that's what you absolutely need. You need courage in an organisation. So this is one of those situations where not everyone's going to like what you do. You know, Ian mentioned that I work quite closely with Telstra in fixing this issue, and we did it before the ASX requirements came into place. And you know, one thing that the CEO, so the CEO at that time was Sol Trujillo, and the head of HR was a lady by the name of Andrea Grant. What they needed was absolute courage, because what happened was we worked significantly with the men in the business, and to be honest, most of the men were fantastic, grabbed it, wanted to get involved. But there were many men also who were very upset by this and thought that this was about positive discrimination against men. So being able to be courageous in your approach was very, and there were some women who objected as well. And I should say to you, I am not pro-affirmative action. So I fundamentally believe it should be the best person for the job. But it is not a level playing field here in Australia. And in levelling the playing field, that means that sometimes we need to treat people as individuals rather than treating everyone the same. So it fundamentally, I think that, and I think the thing is, you know, the most common thing I hear around the executive table in Australia is pretty much, Maureen, I'm colourblind, I don't have these issues. I can see that other people do, but I don't. And I'm really good, because I always hire on the basis of merit, always. And what I like to challenge people with is actually, you know, did you know that merit is actually subjective? So the person that I think is best for the job is not the same person you might think, because we're going to put our own lens over it. So courage, I think, is very important. The other economic factor to recognise is the economic power of women, which I think is often, oh, thank you very much, the economic power is sometimes completely forgotten by organisations. So women as a stakeholder group have a growth market that is bigger than China and India combined. So in terms of that, women as consumers, women are more likely to buy based on values rather than value. It's a basic marketing principle, if you look at any of the marketing research around marketing to women. So this issue is important to women. And it's something, so I've worked with some organisations around actually building an external strategy linked to their internal diversity strategy. Just a few stats that I thought I'd show you. I'm sure it doesn't surprise any of you about women control 20 trillion in consumer spending around the world, and women's earnings are rising quite rapidly. But in terms of household income in Australia, we spend 90 cents in every household dollar. So we have got a lot of buying power, which needs to be built in, I believe, to every strategy. You've got to have a commercial element. Skill shortage. I think the important thing to recognise about skill shortage in Australia is that, you know, we flew through the global economic crisis with skill shortage very much in place. So Australia, as a country, is looking for new skills. So we need to recognise that we've got a very underutilised group. And some of that goes back to girls at school. So to me, I guess I was very fortunate in that my father really pushed my sister and I on maths and science, and we managed to be good at maths and science. And that was a great grounding. But a lot of this work needs to start at school level around what subjects people are taking, what courses people are going to take. You know, and around things that, you know, may not be the easiest course, but girls need to be encouraged and understand the importance of economic security to them in the future at a young age. And I certainly think that there's a big piece which needs to be done in respect of that. You know, I was horrified to hear from someone who was a very senior businesswoman who had gone to present to a group of to a large group of grade 12 girls in one of our most prestigious schools in Brisbane. And, you know, 50% of them put their hand up when asked the question of, you know, what are you going to do? Who wants to, you know, have a life of, they envisage their life as marrying someone wealthy and staying at home and looking after children. Yeah, 50% of them put their hand up, that's what they wanted. So it's and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. There's not. You've got to take on board anyone else's decisions. But they had no clue of what the divorce rate is. They had no clue about women's economics in Australia. So in terms of women's economics in Australia, we're in a quite dismal state. So 11% of women in Australia live in poverty, whereas about 1% of men do. Why is that? Divorce rate, single parentdom, there's a whole lot of factors. But off-ramping, giving up careers is a big one. So I try to get to women when they're when they're young, in their workforce, and I say to them, you know what? Choose to have a family, that's fantastic, I did it too. Keep your nose in somehow, some way throughout your career. Don't lose it completely. Then you have choice, then you have freedom, because you never know what's going to happen. Okay, engagement. I think a really important element of engagement, which is often missed, is respect. People want to be treated with respect. So if you are different in some way, shape or form, and you feel like you have to comply all the time, it doesn't necessarily mean that you feel respect. I was showing some images yesterday to a group of a woman in a burqa. And, you know, in that organisation, they said, well, you know, if she walked in here, we'd feel very, very suspicious of her. And it was one of those things where I thought, well, you know, imagine that situation, imagine the lack of respect that someone like that would feel. Someone like that would not feel comfortable in coming out with ideas, suggestions and what have you. She would feel like she had to comply. She probably wouldn't work at that organisation, to be honest. So, but understanding the economic value of engagement. So you're all probably aware there is a stack of research which shows that if you have engaged employees, you are much more likely to have a profitable organisation. And also to recognise that it costs about 4 times to continually hunt and retrain new people. So it's important. And to me, just conscious of time, is that female engagement is sometimes different. So the other, you know, the big notion I get in executive teams, we have to treat everyone the same. We have this notion of fairness in Australia, which I think is part of our problem, to be honest. And I don't think it's a bad thing, but it comes from mateship, it comes from the Anzac spirit. And fairness means treating everyone the same. And that's assuming that everyone is the same as the dominant norm, which in Australia happens to be white, male, heterosexual, and of a particular age group. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that group, because I love a lot of men who are in that group, but there's a lot of other people who don't fit into that category. And that applies to both men and women. So if you've got, you know, I've had issues, you know, for example, with men who are on executive teams, and they're not part of the football crowd, and they're not part of the, you know, they don't want to go to the pub, and they want to get home and see their families, and they like the ballet, and they're not gay. But they feel very uncomfortable as well. So in terms of that diversity, some of these things equally apply to men who don't want to comply with the dominant norm of what they feel is expected. And certainly there are some industries which have that culture to a greater degree than others. So in terms of feminine leadership, it's just recognising that it's different, understanding the rules of marketing to women. So if you can understand some of these things, it's about then approaching the way you might performance manage someone, the way you might mentor someone, the way you would engage an employee to meet that person's needs. The problem with this is then that you're applying a set of rules to every woman as well. And that's where we need to be careful, because not every woman meets all the generalisations, as do, you know, not all men meet all generalisations, but you've got to start somewhere. So this gives a starting point on some of it. Our emotional responses can often be different. Do you know, in the research we've done with men in Australia, which is quite substantial, do you know what men's #1 fear in working with women is? Women crying in their office, terrified. You have no idea at the level of seniority of people who say to me, Maureen, what on earth would I do? Glass of water, cup of tea, tissue. Give a couple of minutes. So it's a real fear though. And you know, it's about acknowledging that and actually giving people strategies and saying, well, you know what? She needs to have that feedback. She really does. Because if you don't give her that feedback, you're giving her a disservice. It's a disservice to her. It will impact her career. You'll have no trouble giving that same feedback to a young man. You need to tell her. You might need to watch the way you say it. And even if she cries, you need to give her that feedback. And that's an education process. So it's actually understanding what that is. So retention, understanding that every time you lose an employee, it costs at least 1.5 times salary, and more if you are more senior. And I think it's important to recognise that women leave for different reasons to men based on the global research. So women are much more likely to leave for these reasons: problems with managers, lack of career, lack of flexibility, values of an organisation, whereas men are more likely to leave because of money. So it's just different. It's not bad. It's just different. But you need to understand the differences. Underutilisation and engagement. You know, and I think that this is an important issue. Are some women workers unrecognised talent by choice? So with most of the organisations I work with, they have the talent pool. You know, the hypos. What I have found is if you do a significant amount of work with the women who are not necessarily in that group, they've self-selected not to be in those groups, and they can be, and with a bit of work and determination, you can get there with them. Attraction, the biggest mistake I see organisations making in Australia is very much deciding, they say, oh, well, we have to fix this women's problem, let's just go out and hire a lot of them. And to me, that is not a solution, because if you hire a whole lot of women, you bring them into an organisation, and you've not got an inclusive culture, they will just leave. So to me, what you've got to work on is engagement, retention, getting this right, education, and then attraction. I had one company telling me they were going to hire a female work crew and get a pink truck, and that would fix it. It'd be a big statement in the organisation. Seriously, listed, large. It's quite many. So there's an increased demand for women in the workplace, but I think that what you want to do is ultimately work towards being able to promote yourself as an external employer of choice for women, but you need to get your ducks right internally first. And that's, barriers to men's engagement. I think, to me, men, as I've said, I think are the key, but I think it's interesting to note some of the barriers to men's engagement. So fear of being blamed or making mistakes, and I think that's a really legitimate and important thing to recognise. So men have said that, that they're actually quite fearful of recriminations around things like sexual harassment, those sorts of things. So therefore, it's easier not to do it. So there will be, a very large proportion of men who will say to me, "Oh, Maureen, I couldn't go out for a coffee with that young girl. What would people think? Or what if I said the wrong thing?" So we've got to tackle that legitimate concern. Like, I remember when I first came back to Australia from London, I was gobsmacked that the senior guys would not go for a drink with me, even to talk about work issue. And, I was big enough and bold enough to tackle that issue, but a lot of women wouldn't, right? And because they wouldn't have the confidence to. So it's one of those things we have to, women, we have to help men. I don't think I'm supportive of inappropriate behaviour at all, but we need to help make men feel comfortable. So fear of other men's disapproval, lack of awareness of the cost of inequity, but especially the personal cost. I think this is an interesting one. Who in the room has sons? Who would like their son to grow up and marry a woman who actually brought in 50-50 in the financial arrangement in the household? Jason. So I think the thing is that in Australia we also have a very strong culture for men that men have to be the primary breadwinners. It's part of our definition of success, of a male definition of success, which is an enormous pressure. So if men are made redundant, those sorts of things, the incidence of depression and those sorts of things are much, much higher than women because it's part of our fundamental ethos. And personally, I think that's not fair. And personally, I think that if you live in a household where you've got a little bit more equality, then that makes men's life better as well. So it may be the future that you would prefer for your son. Have a think about it. Here you go. Apathy. So that's just that notion of, well, it's just not about me. But I think what's important in Australia, and I'm going to close off because I'm conscious of your time, is that men don't get the business case. And I don't mean that, again, in a derogatory way, because I believe we haven't told men what the business case is. So the latest research from Bain found that women had a fair idea that there was an economic case for diversity, but men were largely unaware. So that whole response that you sometimes get is, about is this positive discrimination, etc., is very much around a lack of understanding. They just don't know. It hasn't been explained to them. I can't tell you the number of times where I've sat in rooms full of men and explained some of this stuff to them, and they've just gone, well, thank you for someone to finally explain this to me. I just didn't know or understand what this is all about. What I typically find in Australia now is that at executive senior level, men do understand maybe not the nuances of a business case, but understand there is a business case. But middle management have no idea. So they really have not been told, not been educated, and I think that if you're going to make it successful in an organisation, you have to make sure that that happens. I think it's really important with whatever you do to actually measure what you do. So I think that, in terms, you need to understand what your starting point is, you need to understand where, and I think, a big part of that is pay gap. I think I'll just throw up a few stats here in terms of what the pay gap is in Australia. To me, I've worked with organisations where they've made the decision to fix this. You usually can't fix it in year one. You've got to fix it over a period of time, but it's a significant issue. But also a significant statement to be able to make is that we have gender parity in our pay, because most organisations in Australia do not. Now, and I think, it's important what gets measured gets done. So the quota target debate, Liz Broderick was obviously really pushed the quota target debate. at first I wasn't supportive of it because I was doing so much work with men. I thought we're really starting to get men engaged in this and we need to give it a chance. But then in looking at the numbers, I think, well, we've been so dismally unsuccessful in this for a country that normally punches above its weight and things. We need something to make this happen. So if there are not targets and things in place, this will not be a priority, and it really needs to be. So that's what's happening in Australia now is setting those targets. You know, what you need to do is be able to demonstrate that you've got a track record, and that needs to happen over a period of time. Okay, and then just finally, in terms of organisations, the other factor that I often see is that executives will know that this is important to the business, but if you ask them why, they can't tell you. So it's really important for an organisation to go through a process of understanding, well, what is their core story for diversity? Why are they doing it? And if they tell me it's about compliance, we dig deeper and spend another 5 hours. So to me, they need to understand, so that each of them as leaders are singing from the same hymn sheet. So if they are asked about diversity, they are all telling the same story. They all need to be in unanimous agreement. And that takes some work, but that is a starting point. I then, once they've got their story, I make them make a public commitment to it. So they have to go and actually go and start talking to people about it. I'm quite bossy, by the way. They need to then sell the story to the four corners of the organisation, because it's important to recognise that this is about cultural change. So again, if organisations decide to dabble in this space, they will fail. So if you see it as a cultural change process, 70% of cultural change processes fail. So if they don't see it as urgent, if they don't see it as something that has got to have a huge amount of momentum, if they don't educate a large proportion of their employees, it's not going to work. And I would usually say to them, don't waste your money. Stop having your tea and bickies for women and thinking that is enough, because it's not going to make any difference. Educational-based approach to me is what works, and making it a public. But where you want to get to, and this is where we got to at Telstra, is a critical mass. So there comes a point in time where you get a lot of resistance, you get a lot of resistance, you get a lot of resistance, then it tips. And people start to understand this is the way we do business. This is the way things operate in this organisation, and it's important to this organisation. And then you start to see other things, like what we sort of started to see at Telstra were things like, men deciding that the men at Telstra were going to support the White Ribbon campaign. They also did something very commercial around that. So there was a whole lot of things that people became engaged in. And it took a brave CEO to kick that off. So Sol Trujillo, love him or hate him, I personally think he's a great man. He was very disturbed about the lack of diversity in Australia, because he personally had to confront it. And he said, if you're a man in my business and you don't get this, I don't want you. I don't care how senior you are. Big, bold statement from a CEO. And nobody liked it. How dare you? But that's what it took to actually get to that tipping point. And that's what you need to do. So you can't dabble. It's got to happen. With force over a period of time, and lots of momentum and consistency. Tokenism, it just won't make a difference. Don't do it. Don't waste your money. Don't, that's my advice to organisations. Just don't do it. And it's all about getting to that tipping point. Okay. I want to just say, I'll just flick through this. Just finally want to say, to me, what is it? Why does Australia have the statistics that it does? And to me, what we have is a lot of very fixed ideas around people. I personally believe that a lot of those habits come from a good place. So if I talk about my daughter Celine, I have unconscious biases vis-a-vis my daughter Celine, but they come from love. I want to protect her. I want to make sure she doesn't fall. So I tell her she can't ride a bike, and then she does. right? That happens all the time in the workplace. So I know for me, as a senior executive of a large organisation, a lot of the things that happened to me were completely unconscious and came from a really good place. Oh, Maureen, we didn't invite you out for drinks because we thought you might need to organise a babysitter. Oh, we didn't put you on that 4-day program because, oh, how could you do that? You're a single mum. So they weren't nasty. And I think this is the important thing to recognise about biases, is that sometimes they can come from a very good place. I think the other important thing to recognise is that all of us have biases. None of us are colourblind, for want of a better word. All of us have perceptions of people that come from our childhood, from our teachers, from our experiences. But one thing I'd say to you is, you know that you only have to have one experience with a particular class of person. And particularly if it's highly emotive, you're likely to tar everyone in that group with the same brush. So what I'd say to you is challenge your thinking. You might be right, but challenge your thinking. You know, I always give the example of, you know, if you've got an unconscious bias or a belief system that young Indigenous males are lazy, and your HR team put a young Indigenous male in your group, how are you going to treat him? Unconsciously. You're going to micromanage him. You're not likely to mentor him. You're not likely to put him on that training course. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it? Or, if that young boy has enough courage, he fights, he works hard, and he proves you wrong. That's what I did. But not everyone has the courage to do that. And then what does he become? Oh, maybe young Indigenous males are not so lazy. No, he's an exception to the rule. Right? So I think it's really important to recognise that it's a... And look, I just finally, as I said before, really important to recognise that merit is completely subjective. And if you can get that message through in your organisations and also in your own thought processes, you might be right and you might not have any biases in what you're thinking, but you need to challenge yourself. And for those of you who are managers and leaders in the audience, you know, challenge people on how they've made decisions. And don't accuse anyone of being biased, because people's natural reaction is to bristle and to justify. But ask questions. Ask questions, delve deeper, and understand that this can bring phenomenal value to organisations. So thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, conscious of time, so we are going to move into some questions, but if you do have to leave, please feel free to do so at this point. As indicated earlier, the roving mics will be, microphones will be coming around the room. If you can wait till the microphone arrives, as I've indicated, that will enhance certainly the clarity of the question and more likely the informativeness of the response. Do we have any questions for Maureen?
It's just what I needed, some honey tea. Whoever's idea that was fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been doing a little bit of work around women entrepreneurs, like
Yes.
SME businesses, and I'm just interested, you've covered a lot of things about women in the workplace, but I'm just interested from a women business owner perspective.
Yep.
Some of the challenges, discriminations they might face in Australia.
Look, I think the interesting thing about female entrepreneurs, you know, the number of female-owned businesses is increasing at a rate which is 3 times greater than male-owned SMEs. And what is happening in Australia is that women get to a certain level in corporate Australia and they kind of give up. They go, you know what, I had enough of this. And if you look at them, people will think it's about babies and children and things, but actually if you look at them, they're then going and running their own business. So there are a lot of strong female entrepreneurs in Australia. And I think that, but what's interesting is I was working with a US-based organisation who's come to Australia, and they've got all these stats on women SMEs being suppliers to large corporations, and they found that where SMEs were engaged by large corporations, only 5% were female-owned SMEs. So what the female SMEs are suffering from is not engaging with those big corporations in terms of their services. Which is, so that's, you know, I think, to me, once we start to get this right, one thing I work on in organisations is supplier diversity. So it's actually recognising that we need to look at supplier and there needs to be some diversity. And some organisations in the United States, like Mobil and Shell, actually have built it into their tender processes.
Thank you, Maureen, for your very interesting talk, and I hope your throat gets better quickly.
I apologise.
You mentioned a lot about education in girls' schools in particular. I may have missed it, but what about in boys' schools?
Well, look, you're right, and you know, I apologise for not mentioning that as well, because I absolutely agree. There's some stuff that it would be good for boys to know. Any one of my friends in my family who've got boys, they get lots of messages around what they should be teaching their boys. You know, and a lot of those messages, to be honest, come from mothers. You know, it's around, you know, stereotypes which exist in kids from a really young age. You know, she does this, he does that. I remember one of my daughters coming home from school when they were in about grade 4, and my daughter said to me, and there were boys and girls in the class, and my daughter said to me, "Oh, Mummy, girls are hairdressers or teachers." And I said, who told you that? And what the teacher, who was a beautiful woman, lovely older woman, had done is she'd set up this game in the classroom where, you know, the girls could be teachers with her in the middle or hairdressers on the side, and the boys could do construction. Completely unintended. It's completely unintended. So to me, working with teachers to help them understand this and to bring those messages through in schools to both girls and boys is really, really important. The most urgent message, though, to me, is young girls and understanding that economic security is important. Now, the financial literacy of girls is much lower than that of boys at the age of about 18. That's a problem. That's a real problem. So, you know, to me, women need to understand numbers. I read a terrific book a couple of years ago, and it was Robert Kiyosaki's book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, right? And it was all about educating children about economics early. And I hadn't even thought of that, right? So what I started to do was, you know, my 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, I could, you know, explaining things like, well, what is a liability? What is a, you know, and get them to be not afraid of understanding finances and money, because they need to. It's a critical skill and it's not taught well at schools.
Hi, I'm Nicole. I'm actually a product of what's happened or what you just discussed here.
Right.
I came from a government background and also worked in private. I got frustrated, got challenged and went overseas and worked for a number of years in multi-diversity area, diversity people, and it was just fantastic. Can't since come back. Frustrated again, and then set up my own business. But I've actually taken a step back because I also have twin girls, and not without their challenges as well. But I just wanted to get an understanding, is a lot of people, probably maybe women and men, a lot of us sort of went overseas and were working in very, very different areas. Is that sort of something that you've also come across, where there's a skills shortage?
Look, it's something that Australian companies don't do well, is recognising the talent pool of Australians that are overseas. There's an organisation called Advance, which actually connects Australians who are abroad and tries to encourage companies to recognise that there's this pool of people, many of whom would love to come back to Australia, but they just haven't got the opportunity. Companies are taking it slow to get onto that notion. I think that there's a lot of unique experience which can come from overseas, and I think that I think it's about that inclusivity, that culture of inclusivity. I don't think that they're, unless maybe it's the UK and the US, I don't know whether there's as much weight put on overseas experiences as perhaps there should be. And then valuing the input which can come. You know, certainly I've had friends who've come back to Australia and just, you know, people don't want to listen to me really. So, but I think, look, the important thing with women like yourself is organisations need to recognise that there is a whole pool of women out there who have gone away and had children and are highly, highly educated. They might have started businesses and what have you, but that is a huge resource. You need to recruit them in a different way to just advertising, because they're actually not likely to reply. They need to have some conversations around, because what happens when you're out of the workplace for a longer period of time is you lose confidence, and you lose confidence in applying. You might want to get back to earning something. You may not want to work full time, but you know it's about, so organisations need to approach women who have left in different ways. But female entrepreneurs and the business skills that they've had to develop make excellent executives.
Thank you very much, Maureen. I just wanted to get your opinion on some of the HR debate that is surrounding the use of the word diversity at the moment, whether you think we need to be more specific, clarified, and say, well, actually it's gender diversity that we want on boards rather than just just diversity on boards, but rather to push that gender aspect. Otherwise we'll end up with diverse boards, but we might not get the women. Yeah, look, I think that's a really important point, because what I find in organisations is that in some organisations that they feel really comfortable in saying, oh, we want diversity in our organisation, we want to have difference of thought, but they're kind of not brave enough to take that other step and sort of say, you know, we're going to start with women, right? Because actually more than 50% of the population, look at the stats, it's ridiculous, let's actually start to do something about this. So you need to push it and be very specific. I had an argument with an executive team yesterday about this exact point. I said, your message cannot be just, this is about diversity of thought. You need to take the big brave step and say, okay, we've got a real issue in this country vis-a-vis women, and we need to fix it in some way, shape or form. So it's it's challenging and saying, you know what, this is what it has to be. So I think that, you know, don't be wishy-washy with messages around what it is.
Question here, and then the last one's here.
Good afternoon, Maureen. I'd like to ask you about age and experience and the diversity there, and how you think you would shift the culture with male executives when maybe an older woman or a woman with more experience is competing with younger male and women for a similar job. So they've got maybe experience and age. And look, you know,
if I look at some organisations, they will focus on a couple of areas of diversity, but to name it and be specific about that, and one of those areas is age. And I think that, you know, to me, the work that you need to do in an organisation is around inclusivity, and part of that is to build in the age factor. So some of what I do is actually to challenge people on what their thinking is vis-a-vis older people and their ability to work, but also younger people and their ability to work. So, you know, in some of the images that we show, the image that I get the biggest reaction from across the executive team is a picture of two Gen Y boys playing a computer game. I wouldn't hire them. I wouldn't hire them, is what they say. So they've built quite a stereotype around, well, they'll be unreliable. They'll, you know, all of these things. Or maybe I'd get them to come and help me with my computer. So there are stereotypes at both ends of the equation. So what organisations need to do is to challenge the stereotype. So my biggest statement is to ask yourself, is that really true? Do you really know that? is that person, that woman who's coming in for the role, just because she's got a 9-month-old and she happens to be 32, is she really going to have another one? Are you really making the assumption that she's going to have another one? And even if she does have another one, why are you assuming that she won't go back to work? You know, so there's a whole lot of assumptions that we just make, you know, around people, and ages at both ends of the spectrum is certainly one of them. And also for women in that childbearing years. Now, people will not say it, they will not call it in an interview, but they will often assume, oh, she's of childbearing age, better not hire her. She might be pregnant already. Good grief.
Hi Maureen, thanks for the talk today. Quick question around the business case idea you were talking about before. Obviously, gender diversity is a large change program. It can't happen quickly. A lot of it is about getting talent in your pipeline. How long do large organisations actually take to realise some of the benefits of a diversity program?
Okay, so that's why, to me, I always recommend a bit of an acceleration program, because I think if it happens too slowly, you lose momentum. Right, because you need to see results in a reasonably short period of time, I think. So in Telstra, for example, we had a 2-year acceleration program and we achieved the results within 2 years. Did it impact Telstra financially? Look, it's one of those things where with there being so few companies in Australia who have been successful in this, there's not enough data to be able to show what the results are. But, you know, I think if you could look at business case in terms of, there are stats that you can measure, things like, you know, retention of women, you know, hires of women, all of those sorts of things. And that's why I like to, you know, where we can, add some sort of commercial element to what we're doing in diversity, because if you can do that, then you can see some financial results quite quickly, because it's important to do that.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Maureen for a fantastic...
Thank you. Thank you, darling.